It is no secret that Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann are not best friends forever.
Did we just become best friends?
Yep.
And that is why this game is so important. Magnus Carlsen just got his revenge on Hans Niemann by checkmating Hans Niemann in 42 moves, and wow, the finish to this game is going to shock you guaranteed. Here's how it all started. In the game, Hans Niemann was playing white. He opens 1e4, and Magnus Carlsen goes e5, and very fast we get an Italian game on the board with 3 bishop c4. Now, Hans Niemann has been playing a ton of the Italian lately with 3 bishop c4, much more so than the Roy Lopez, so let's see what Magnus Carlsen has in mind to throw his opponent off guard. Now, Magnus starts knight f6, d3 from Hans, and here the first surprise of the game is the move h6. Okay, this move is just super trendy at the highest level. This move does a few different things. First of all, obviously, locking down the g5 square forever. You are never going to have a knight or a bishop hitting that. However, beyond that idea, Black also has the idea of going g7 to g5, attacking on the king side. Of course, that's not the only idea. Black can also go for a very simple setup with d6 and bishop e7, or he can also bring that bishop out to the c5 square later. So overall, very flexible move from Magnus Carlsen. Now, c3 from Hans, this is the main move, threatening d4, and Magnus Carlsen plays the move d6. Okay, this officially commits him to keeping that bishop on e7 or g7 and is no longer going to the c5 square, so very committal idea from Magnus. And now Hans Niemann, I'm not sure if he had this idea prepared specifically for this game, but he unleashes a very cool idea. He starts with a4. Okay, Magnus, he goes bishop e7. Again, a very committal idea. Typically, if you want to go g7 to g5, you want to have your bishop on g7. So Magnus already committing to the classical development of the bishop. And now Hans Niemann continues with his idea with the move a5. Okay, this is already super interesting. I mean, white technically threatens a6 in some lines. He can also follow up b4 to b5. And this idea of just gaining space on the queen side has been very, very trendy lately. I mean, Fabiano Caruana, another big Italian specialist, has played this idea quite a lot recently. So what does Magnus Carlsen do? Well, he just castles on the king side. I mean, so far, Magnus with a very solid but passive setup with bishop e7 and short castles. And here, Hans Niemann unleashes his idea. He pushes the pawn all the way to the a6 square. I mean, this is just wild stuff. You almost never see this from white in the Italian. But I gotta say, I love it. I mean, Alpha Zero is my second favorite chess player, right behind Hans Niemann. So seeing Hans Niemann play the Alpha Zero attack with a4, getting Arnold Schwarzenegger, the a-pawn down the board, awesome stuff. Okay, here, Black has to make a decision. What does he do about that Alpha Zero Arnold Schwarzenegger a-pawn? Well, in the game, Magnus goes b6. The idea behind this move is just trying to avoid making too many weaknesses on the queen side. It keeps his pawns connected there, and that bishop does have pressure on the a6 pawn. I mean, maybe that pawn will be a weakness in the future. Hit, wink, wink, but you gotta stick around to see that. Okay, Hans finally castles, getting his king to safety, and Magnus starts by challenging that bishop on the c4 square. Very solid move from Magnus. And here, there is simply no good way for Hans Niemann to deal with the threat other than taking the bishop on e6. Now, real fast, for example, if Hans Niemann, I don't know, went knight to d2, tried to defend, here Black has a very easy game, simply taking the bishop, then going d7, connecting the rooks, and here Magnus is just fine. He might even be a little bit better, as that pawn on a6 is starting to turn into a weakness. Okay, but instead of that, Hans Niemann, my favorite player, and yes, I do mean that, he takes the bishop on e6, and here Magnus simply takes back, and we have a very interesting pawn structure on the board. Here Black has those double pawns, and it's up for debate if those are a strength or a weakness. I mean, on the one hand, Black does weaken the light squares on the king side. He does have double pawns that could be attacked in the future. I mean, especially that pawn on e6, maybe queen b3 at some point in the future is going to attack it. But on the other hand, those e-pawns do give Black excellent control over these central squares, and Black even has the idea of rook f7, queen d7, and rook a to f8, doubling rooks on the f-file. And that could be very, very dangerous if Hans Niemann doesn't see it coming. So that's Black's plan. What is White going to do about it? Well, White's main idea here is going to be gaining space on the queen side and in the center. Ideas like b4 to b5 are going to be in play, and also d3 to d4. Okay, Hans Niemann here starts knight b to d2, the standard developing move for that knight. Now, queen d7 from Magnus, solid stuff. That queen defends the e6 pawn, but it also starts to connect the rooks and allows a rook f7 to rook a to f8 idea. Now, rook e1 from Hans, supporting e4, and Magnus rook a to d8. Is this guy planning d5? That would be a pretty solid option. Okay, here, I've investigated this position quite a bit, trying to figure out what is going on, and I think this is where Hans Niemann actually started to go astray. In the game, he plays the move knight to f1. Now, this move is technically not a major mistake. It's still okay. However, it's connected to an idea that simply does not work in this position. Here, Hans Niemann's plan in this game is to go knight g3, bishop e3, and d4. However, that is not really the right idea for white here. I mean, just thinking this through logically, black here seems to have an edge on the king side. He has that open f-file. He's going to play rook f7, rook a to f8, and I'm not sure white should be swinging pieces over to the king side. Instead, the computer loves the idea of keeping that knight on d2 and simply gaining space on the queen side with b4. From there, you can go b4 to b5, perhaps queen b3, perhaps d3 to d4, and you already have the d4 and the e4 squares perfectly defended. You don't need to bring the knight to f1 to g3 to pull that off. So, knight f1, not necessarily a bad move itself. However, it is connected with an idea of pressuring on the king side, which is simply not justified here. Instead, he should have been looking at queenside play, starting with b2 to b4. Okay, Magnus, what does he do? Well, he instantly gets the essence of the position. He doubles his rooks on the f-file, and that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on Hans Niemann's position. Now, Hans, knight g3, continuing the plan. I mean, knight g3 itself is already a big mistake. He had to keep that knight on f1. And here, Magnus Carlsen has a few different ideas that he can choose from. And in the game, he chooses this idea based on pressuring that pawn on the a6 square. He starts that with queen to c8. So what is Magnus Carlsen's idea? His idea here, I think, is the idea of knight to b8 at some point in the future, putting pressure on a6. And of course, that queen now vacates the d7 square, so he has ideas based on knight to d7, opening up those rooks on the f-file. So, interesting move from Magnus. Of course, the computer, as it always does, it finds an incredible idea. I want to show it to you real fast before we get back to the game. And that is the move knight to h7. Now, what's the idea? First of all, obviously, you open up the rooks on the f-file. That looks pretty dangerous. But after white's move, let's say bishop e3, here, Magnus Carlsen has the option of sacking the rook on f3. Boom! Rook takes f3. The idea, after g takes f3, you go knight g5, putting pressure on that pawn on f3. Then white has to take. You take back with the bishop, and here black is dominating the king side on the dark squares. I mean, black's going to follow up queen f7, pressuring f3, and from there, bishop f4, perhaps getting the queen into the game. And despite being off the exchange, that extra rook is simply not doing anything for the time being, and Magnus Carlsen would be firmly in control here. So knight h7, intending rook takes f3 on the next move would have been an idea. Magnus Carlsen does not go for it in the game, but just a cool trick to keep in mind for your own games. Okay, back to the game. Queen c8 from Magnus Carlsen. Like we talked about, the idea of pressuring a6 and also preparing knight to d7. Now from here, Hans Niemann just continues his plan. Bishop e3, and then the move d4, breaking in the center. And because Magnus went for this slightly awkward plan of queen c8 and knight d7, suddenly Hans has a very stable edge. I mean, this just fully justifies Hans Niemann's idea in the first place. Okay, Magnus Carlsen, our boy, he is the GOAT. We cannot count him out. What does he have planned here? Well, the first thing he has to do is find a way to get counterplay against that powerful center of Hans Niemann. And the way he does it is he starts by taking on d4. E takes, then c takes. Now Magnus has eliminated his doubled pawns on the e-file. That is a good start. Okay, from here, knight d to b8. Magnus is trying to pile up on that a-pawn. And in this position, Hans Niemann instantly blitzes out the move queen to e2, simply defending the pawn on a6. However, this move lets Magnus Carlsen instantly back into the game. Instead of that, he should have been thinking about the very aggressive idea of d4 to d5. Now, this move is not super hard to find. It's just hard to understand all the implications of it. The idea is if black goes knight e5, or if he takes on d5 first, then goes knight e5, Hans Niemann has to follow up knight to d4. This is the idea. I mean, the knight is coming into the powerful e6 square. Even if Magnus Carlsen manages to win that pawn on a6, Hans Niemann would be simply dominating the position here. Instead, queen e2 on the board, Hans Niemann defending a6, but this move is just way too slow, and he misses the idea for d5. Now, Magnus Carlsen demonstrating his sagacity. He gets the essence of the position, and he immediately strikes on the queen side with the very sagacious move knight to b4. This move from Magnus is absolutely key in the position. The idea is he's freeing up that c-pawn to crash through to the c5 square. And after rook e to c1, Magnus just goes for it, c5, and already the computer is saying that Magnus Carlsen has the edge in this position. I mean, wow, how the tides have turned so quickly. Hans Niemann missing that idea on move 19, playing queen to e2 instead of d5, fighting for the initiative. And already Magnus just takes control of the game with idea based on knight b4 and c5. Now, what is Hans Niemann supposed to do? Well, I'll tell you what he's not supposed to do here, and that is the move e5. This is what he played in the game. And now after d5 from Magnus, the center is locked, and it looks like white has a space advantage, and he does. However, all of the play belongs to Magnus here. I mean, look at his rooks, the c-pawn breaking down on d4. Magnus Carlsen is just in complete control, and it's rapidly turned into a good version for black of a Caro-Kann or a French defense. Okay, from here, Hans Niemann takes on c5. Magnus takes back, and now kind of a cute idea from Hans, but it's not very good, and that is the move knight to d4. The idea, obviously, is if you take the knight, Hans Niemann takes the queen, and that is game over. So Magnus does not do that. However, Magnus has the option of just retreating the queen off the c-file. Now that c-pawn is defended, and it turns out here the best move for Hans is actually knight to f3, simply retreating the knight. I mean, that shows just how bad that knight d4 idea was in the first place. But of course, Hans does not retreat the knight there. Instead, he goes knight c2. I guess his idea is trying to break off that knight on b4, but now the knight is way away from the king side where it needs to be to defend. Oh, this is just going from bad to worse for Hans. Okay, Magnus d4, breaking in the center, gaining more space. Now, rook d1 from Hans, more tricks. Obviously, the pawn is pinned. You can't take because you lose the queen, but Magnus Carlsen, he does not fall for any of Hans Niemann's tricks. He just clogs up that d-file with knight d5, and now Hans has to retreat the bishop for real. Bishop d2. Now, the problem with this is Magnus Carlsen has the chance to crash through on the f2 square with the move rook takes f2. This is so strong. I mean, under normal circumstances, the queen is worth at least 2 rooks, so normally white. Now, under typical circumstances, that queen is worth at least the 2 rooks, so normally Hans could take the rook. Then after rook takes, king takes, he should be doing okay. But in this position, black has too much of an attack. White's pieces are all on these weird out-of-place squares, and black gets the attack going immediately. Bishop h4, pinning the knight. Queen f7 is coming next, and here Magnus Carlsen would just obliterate Hans Niemann. So of course, Hans does not take back the rook. However, that means he just lost a clean pawn on the king side, and that is a pawn he needed to defend. Oh boy, Magnus Carlsen's kingside attack is coming together. This is going to be a wild finish, so make sure you stick around for the end. Okay, what does Hans do? He starts queen g4, trying to keep the game alive, and that pawn on g7 is of course pinned to the king. Now, the computer says Magnus Carlsen doesn't even need to defend. He can play the move knight to c6, and somehow it all works out. I mean, if white takes on h6, black just goes bishop d8 for some reason, and now technically the pawn on g7 is defended and black has the initiative. But Magnus Carlsen at this point had 22 seconds on the clock. He is not taking risks. He wants to beat Hans Niemann no matter what. So after queen g4, king h8, simply getting out of the attack. Now if white goes bishop takes h6, Magnus can take back with the pawn, and he is just winning. So instead of that, Hans Niemann knight h5. He is continuing the attack. And now bishop d8, Magnus Carlsen just continues to defend. Okay, if you know Hans Hans Niemann, if you study his games, you know this guy does not like to defend passively. When he is backed into a corner, he lashes out, even if it's not technically the best move. And that is exactly what happens here. Hans Niemann lashes out with the move b4. What is this doing? Honestly, I think he's just trying to press Magnus Carlsen in time trouble. At this point, Hans Niemann has 21 seconds on the clock, and Magnus has 17 seconds, so not a bad idea. Okay, knight c6. Magnus brings the knight into the game. Very good move. Now, Hans takes the pawn, but Magnus takes back on e5, hitting the queen. Magnus is starting to take over. What is Hans Niemann supposed to do? I mean, already the computer likes the idea of taking on g7, simply transferring into an endgame, where here black is lost, but the computer thinks it's the least bad idea. Instead, Hans keeps the queens on the board. Technically a worse move, but it is a better practical idea. With the queens on the board, the game is more complicated. Now, in this position, Magnus Carlsen has a brilliant move that he missed. It's understandable. He has 13 seconds on the clock. The move that wins the game on the spot, the showstopper, is the idea rook takes g2. Why is this move so good? Well, if the king takes the rook, you play queen c6, and the queen has the discovered attack on the king. The knight can go anywhere, e3, f4, and this is just devastating for white. Instead of that, Magnus plays the move bishop c7, lining up yet another piece with the king side. Not bad. Okay, Hans, queen e4. Okay, Hans, queen e4, and Magnus, queen f7. Those pieces are just lining up on the f-file. What is Hans supposed to do? Well, that knight on h5 is being attacked, so Hans Niemann retreats. Knight g3. However, in this position, Magnus, with 9 seconds on the clock, he finds the key idea. That is the move. Knight to f3. Oh my goodness. After g takes, rook takes, the idea is that the attack is worth more than a piece. I mean, the rook and the bishop lining up on that knight on g3, the queen and the rook lining up on f2. This is getting ugly fast. What is Hans supposed to do? Well, he starts knight e2, trying to defend. Now Magnus Carlsen, queen h5. Then Hans tries to trade queens and defend on h3, but Magnus Carlsen is having none of it. Queen e5, threatening queen to h2. Oh my goodness. Now, what is Hans supposed to do? Well, he finds the tricky idea of knight f4. The idea is after Magnus takes on f4, Hans Niemann takes the rook. Of course, that is not the end of the story, because after knight e2, you have the attack on the king and the queen. Oh my goodness, king g2 from Hans, but this is where Magnus Carlsen delivers the final blow, the final insult to his non-existent rival. He starts queen h2. The king has to retreat. Then rook takes f3, hitting the king with check. And after king e1, Magnus Carlsen delivers the checkmate, queen f2, checkmating Hans Niemann. And that is all she wrote in this game. Magnus Carlsen gets his revenge in spectacular fashion. Now, if you enjoyed this game, you can check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist for more of Magnus Carlsen's latest games, and I'll see you in the next video.